Hi guys, what's up? Um I'm on partial shadow ban. Can be hard to find my videos. If you want to see my videos, go to vincentbrunoshadowban.blogspot.com. It's at the bottom of the screen and in the description box. Yeah, my videos aren't really available and you can't ever find the first three. So go there. The title of this is Christian Science and Judeo-Freemasonry, though you're going to hear very little about you're going to hear very little about Judeo-Freemasonry, excuse me. Um, if you want everything on Judeo-Freemasonry and Christian Science, go to bewisestserpents.blogspot.com, which is at the bottom of the screen and in the description box. I am looking for ex-Christian scientists to expose Christian Science as a dangerous religion, killing children, not good for your mental health, fallacious, and also connected to Freemasonry. So if that's you, if you're ex-Christian scientist and like getting involved in that, or just have any questions, or if anyone has any questions, you can email me at vincent.bruno.1229@gmail.com. It's at the bottom of the screen and it's in the description box. I'm also looking for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, ex-Mormons, and ex-Seventh-day Adventists, and their connections to Freemasonry. So they're also at bewisestserpents.blogspot.com, and at the top of the screen you will see a link that goes to the Seventh-day Adventist version of that website, but harmlessassdoves.blogspot.com. So I'm looking for you guys too, because I'm ex-Jehovah's Witness and we were raised in Freemasonry, and there's a lot of interesting connections. And also I think there's I like the idea of revenge, kind of going after them by sullying them, by showing their real true past and real true history, and how they were connected to Freemasonry and actually Judeo-Freemasonry and Judaism, which they were very connected. Okay, we are reading Mrs. Eddy by Edwin Dankin, and it's a very unflattering biography written in 1929 about her. It's, he obviously didn't like her. And then we are listening to Mary Baker Eddy's Science and Health textbook in between. So if you give me a second, let me just get to where I was. Okay, hold on. Okay. So what's happening now is Mary Baker Eddy is getting very old, and she's decided that the house that she was living under is under attack from malicious animal magnetism, which is the idea that if people are thinking negatively about you, that it can affect you physically and mentally. And so she's convinced that the house she's living in Concord, New Hampshire, is full of malicious animal magnetism. And so she has fled to a retreat. They've built her a new house in the woods in Massachusetts. Even in her last days, Mrs. Eddy retained her gift of rallying immediately in times of stress. The world's enterprising reporters had arrived to knock at her door, and perhaps the least auspicious moment of her uneasy life. And yet, even from this tremendous shock, Mrs. Eddy arose promptly, bravely, and with magnificent gusto, ready to lay around her on all sides with her broadsword and stoutly defend her fortifications from the worst attacks she ever had to face. Her pen could still be as biting as ever, and there were times when she yet could rise to use it with her old jab and twist. She could still find energy, for instance, to write 3,000 words reply to McClure's magazine and demand with vim who or what is McClure. Who or what is the McClure history so-called presenting? Is it myself, the veritable Mrs. Eddy, whom the New York World declared dying of cancer, or is it her alleged double or dummy dummy heretofore to thank the enterprising historians for the testimony they have thereby given of the divine power of Christian Science, which they admit has snatched me from the cradle and the grave and made me the leader of the world, made me the leader of the good men and women in other countries. Very high opinion of herself. Mary Baker Eddy was a warrior until the end, and she still needed every resource, for she had yet to deal with Augustus Stetson. For days, for months, for years, Mrs. Eddy had been craftily, fearfully biding her time. She knew now that this time had come. Perhaps indeed she had delayed too long. There were times when she must have regretted that she had not acted years before, for she now was certain that in Augusta she had been deceived. Augusta honeyed words were only the words of the fiend. Mrs. Eddy had a great deal of outside assistance in reaching this conclusion. Almost from the beginning of the sensational newspaper publicity that broke upon Mrs. Eddy in late 1906, the Metropolitan Press intimated that Augustus Stetson was Mrs. Eddy's logical successor. Enterprising newspaper reporters did not find it difficult to locate Christian Scientists in New York who were convinced that Mrs. Stetson was directing streams of malicious animal magnetism against the unfortunate old woman at Pleasant View in order to hasten the dawn of a new regime when she herself could inherit the kingdom. It was at this time that malicious animal magnetism first was seen in the headlines of the Metropolitan Press, and so mysterious was the strange symbol that no fancies seemed to improbable for the imagination of excited newspaper reporters. It was printed in all seriousness that Mrs. Stetson and Fry were in mental league to influence Mrs. Eddy's weakened mind to make Augustus Stetson the Eddy heir. Such wild rumors gained currency so rapidly that few of the faithful could resist believing them. Thus it was that the first reader of the Concord Church could write gravely to Cornell Wilson, publicity man in Mrs. Eddy's household, "Would it not be well to protect Mrs. Eddy from the Stetson argument specifically, or other workers doing so? It has troubled me but helped me to hear that Fry was a channel for that diabolism. We are all waiting to know that stuff has no power over the suit." Enterprising newspaper editors know that conflict is the essence of good drama, and good drama on the front page is what helps build circulation. They consequently traced down with all eagerness every rumor of Mrs. Stetson was seeking to oust old Mrs. Eddy from her Boston throne. Mrs. Stetson, being a woman of vast emotions and enthusiasms, was like Mrs. Eddy in that she had tempestuous moods. When words rushed to her tongue, that gave her later cause for regret. And like Mrs. Eddy, she alienated followers who were only too glad in later years to describe some of her worst moments. Then it was that the New York press learned how Mrs. Stetson had once offered to Mrs. Eddy as that woman, declaring that she never healed anybody. One of Mrs. Stetson's old friends was glad to relate how during the time when Mrs. Stetson was studying at Mrs. Eddy's college and was living in Mrs. Eddy's house, she exploded in resentment over Mrs. Eddy's adoption of Foster Eddy. "That little puppy dog," exclaimed Mrs. Stetson. "I will get him out of here. She should have adopted me, not him." Another old friend recalled hearing Mrs. Eddy say as far back as 1896 that Mrs. Stetson had admirable qualities, but I do not admire her. Other asserted that Mrs. Stetson had always discouraged students from going to Boston to study in Mrs. Eddy's college, offering them cheaper tuition if they would take her own course. Still another remembered hearing Mrs. Stetson remark that she was going to put the screws on all Eddy followers who stood in the way of her own ambitions. Probably the majority of these things were actually said under some guise or other. Mrs. Stetson had a temper as well as an ambition, and few who were associated with her for any length of time failed to notice it. And there can be small doubt that Mrs. Stetson expected to succeed Mrs. Eddy to the leadership of Christian Science Church. Mrs. Stetson in later years always denied this by inference, asserting time and again, and neither she nor anyone else could ever take Mrs. Eddy's place. The truth was, of course, that Mrs. Stetson did not expect to take Eddy's place as the discoverer and founder of Christian Science, but she undoubtedly and expected to inherit mantle of directorship over the church organization, and so informed some of her associates. As she pondered over the probability, she decided that after Mrs. Eddy's death, she would move the headquarters of the church from Boston to New York. She intimated as much to several of her confidants at the moment. Revelations of this nature were also published in the New York paper in 1907. The New York editor even discouraged that when collections were being taken up to furnish Mrs. Stetson's new home, one devotee begged for donations with the plea, "We all want to be in on this. It's going to house the Christ." Mrs. Eddy was well aware of all this talk, and less majestic if whoa. Revelations of this nature were also published in the New York paper in 1907. The New York editors even discovered that when collections were being taken up to furnish Mrs. Stetson's new home, one devotee begged for donations with the plea, "We all want to be in on this. It's going to house the Christ." Mrs. Eddy was well aware of this talk of lèse-majesté, if only because Mrs. Stetson sat down and wrote a letter protesting absolute loyalty every time some eager city editor gave space to a new story describing her ambitions. By this time, however, Mrs. Eddy was in a good mood beyond convincing. Her whole universe was crashing and thundering down around her. Her carefully devised retreat had been utterly violated, and she was being dragged before the public for a sanity test. Mrs. Eddy knew what she knew. As she had written in an infinite number of times, she could always tell whose mind was upon her. It is possible that that had she dared, she would have put Augusta out of her church during the storm of 1907. She had in her bylaws one provision which made such an excommunication possible without the possibility of any appeal. Members of this church shall not learn hypnotism or penalty of being excommunicated from this church. If the author of Science and Health shall bear witness to the offense of mental malpractice, it shall be considered as sufficient evidence thereof. But Mrs. Eddy did not dare to put this bylaw into effect. First, one of the indicators of her insanity, as alleged by Chandler, was her very belief in the powers of the malpractitioner. To excommunicate Mrs. Stetson under such a bylaw would thus play straight into the hands of her legal persecutors. Second, Mrs. Eddy was becoming by this time so fearful of the mysterious power of Mrs. Stetson that she herself did not want to make a move that might excite Augusta's wrath against her. Fear of Augusta now amounted practically to an obsession with Mrs. Eddy. Third, it was a serious question whether Augusta could be put out of the church without losing from the Christian Science fold the entire First Church congregation in New York. If Augusta were excommunicated, she had so much personal influence that she might easily take most of her congregation out with her if she so desired, and it was the largest and wealthiest congregation among the branch churches, in many ways more powerful than the mother church itself. This was the first problem with Mrs. Eddy faced in her old age as she dwelt in the shadowy chamber of Chestnut Hill, and faithful practitioners watched the night through, seated outside her door. Already Mrs. Eddy had passed one by one, intended to curb Augusta by halting her rapidly expanding church. She had forbidden overflow meetings. Until this measure was promulgated, Mrs. Stetson was holding a regular Sunday overflow meeting in her reading rooms, and even from this second meeting, she was turning hundreds away. Mrs. Eddy waited a little while and then devised a second bylaw aimed at Augusta's overweening power. She had watched with amazement and even jealousy the thousands who were annually to Augusta's shrine to be healed. She now passed a bylaw forbidding healers to have offices in any church building. Mrs. Stetson and her students had to move out of their practitioners' offices in less than 24 hours' notice. Mrs. Stetson said no single word of protest. Mrs. Eddy herself had always stressed the need for efficient healers in her church. She repeated it time and again that it was healing, not mere teaching, that made converts for Christian Science. She had cut down the charges, allowing teachers time, and again, in order to force them out into healing work. She herself had written Mrs. Stetson in 1902. Hold on. In 1902, I want you to give most of your time to healing. The Department of Christian Science is the one in which no student has equaled me. It is the one to which every student should aspire more than to any other. It is the one vacant at present. It was in healing rather than in teaching or church making that she wanted the members of her church to lead, wrote Mrs. Eddy, adding in conclusion, healing is the foundation of Christian Science, and she was right. The healing department in Mrs. Stetson's church was perhaps the greatest single factor in its marvelous expansion and the most important pillar and support ever designed for the Eddy hierarchy. But in one moment of jealousy and fear, with one sweep of the pen, Mrs. Eddy cast it out. A single sentence from a letter which she wrote to Augusta far back in 1894 explains these characteristics ruthlessly perfectly. this characteristic ruthlessness perfectly. You see, Mrs. Sesson, she wrote, mother cuts off right hands if they are made offensive. Between January and November of 1908, Mrs. Eddy so immured herself at Chestnut Hill that once again the old rumors were revived that she was dead. In May of 1908, Mrs. Eddy had found it once again necessary to issue a general denial of disability, and she phrased it with an acerbity that revealed a growing resentment. She wrote in the New York Herald on May 15th, permit me to say the report that I am sick and I trust the desire thereof is dead and should be buried. Whether the fact that I am well and keenly alive to the truth of being the love that is life is sure and steadfast. I go out in my carriage daily and have omitted my drive but twice since I came to Massachusetts. Either my work, the demands upon my life at home, or the weather is all that prevents my daily drive. On the next day, Mrs. Eddy wrote another notice, which was eventually published in her Sentinel. Having thought about the matter overnight, she had grown extremely indignant over the continuing public interest in her state of health following her experience with newspapers in 1906 and 1907. She said, with all the old Eddy fire and spirit, to whom it may concern, since Mrs. Eddy is watched as one watches a criminal or sick person, she begs to say in her own behalf that she's neither therefore to be criticized or judged by either a daily drive or a stay at home is superfluous. When accumulating work requires it, when accumulating work requires it, or because of a preference to remain within doors, she omits her drive. Do not strain at gnats or swallow camels over it, but try to be composed and resign to the shocking facts that she is minding her own business, and recommends this supervising privilege to all her dear friends and enemies. Okay, let's listen to Christian Science. Science and Health. Hold on.
And I will make ye as gods. More than one God was its starting point. Truth gives the immortal idea or man from spirit, but error, the mortal belief from matter. The express image and likeness of God was immortal man, and there is none other, or ever a man since created. Through a belief of pain and sorrow, error claimed to create man, but truth gave its idea of God in joy, blessing, and dominion. Error's process of creating bases intelligence on matter, or would put intelligence in matter, either of which is impossible, inasmuch as it would make intelligence both God and devil, that is, both good and evil. This belief is proved error, in that it produces sickness, sin, and death. Hence the sentence of wisdom, thou shalt die. The science of being never produced sickness, sin, or death, but destroys them. The symbol of air was the tree of knowledge, which God, the truth of being, forbade man. It symbolized the belief of life and intelligence in matter, of which truth said, partake not, lest ye die. But air replied, truth is at fault. If you acquire knowledge, your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good from evil. That is, men shall be intelligent, God. And these gods, matter called men to distinguish them from another personal God. Is not this idolatry and walking over the spiritual law? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Spirit and matter and soul and sense makes lords many and gods many. Theology, materia medica, mesmerism, and every other ology and ism under the sun originated in this very air. Intelligence and life is God, omnipotent and eternal, and God never in matter, but producing spiritual, harmonious, and immortal man. There is but one God, one life and intelligence, one principle of being, and this heals the sick, gives sight to the blind, destroys error instead of creating it, preaches the gospel to the poor, and is measurably explained in this science of being. The followers of Christ, truth, were not the rabbis, for it came to its own and was not received. Knowledge never enabled man to judge between good and evil. Therefore, it was a falsehood from the beginning, as Jesus said. You were a liar from the beginning, and truth, life, abode not in you. For truth was never in matter, and mortal man is matter, and knowledge was his progenitor. Mortal man is a belief of life and death, of pain and pleasure, sickness and health, good and evil, mixed in one mass, called intelligent matter or personal sense. Adam impersonated this error, and Adam illustrated simply a belief which we have endeavored to explain in its nothingness, together with the reality it would falsely make of the impossibility of life and intelligence in matter. This error or belief shrinks from the voice of truth calling to man, where or what art thou, soul or personal sense? Art thou spirit or matter? And belief replied, I heard thy voice and was afraid. Fear was the first manifestation of the belief of life in matter, for the wicked flee when no man pursueth. Fear founded sickness at death. Error was naked, and it could not bide from the air of wisdom. And truth replied, Who told thee thou art naked? And error fell back on personality, saying, She gave me of the fruit of knowledge. A medical work, perhaps, woman that was taken from my rib, as if man was less the origin of her fault because she was not back again under the rib, told me I was in my body, and that life and sensation are in matter. But when truth questioned woman regarding the knowledge that said matter is intelligent and personal sense is man, she replied, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. Woman was the first to see out of the difficulty owning this knowledge of serpent, as she is the first to lay down the belief that life originates materiality. A serpent hung on the tree of knowledge, metaphorically, to show its subtlety, and the master bade his students be wise as a serpent, that is, never allow the belief of life and sensation and matter to put to silence the opposite, science of being. Woman was a higher idea of God than man, inasmuch as she was the final one in the scale of being, but became, our beliefs reverse every position of truth. We name supreme being masculine instead of feminine. Woman first perceived reason, was beguiled by knowledge. Truth's question to Adam, ere vis-a-vis, is life and intelligence in matter, rebuked and exposed as would be material consciousness. The Lord formed man of the dust and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living soul, put truth in air, intelligence in matter, made the body mortal embrace the principle of being that embraces man. Did the infinite enter matter through man's nostrils? Did God, the truth and life, enter the pig, sinning and dying body? Then deity would be man, or man deity, and life mortal. This absurd belief is atheism. When God, who is our life, shall appear, then we shall be like him. Man will be perfect, sinless, and eternal when spirit permeates man. Principle never entered its idea, nor spirit matter. We have no record in Genesis that God gave Adam, air, dominion over the earth, and yet, to belief, air holds this way. Adam was the product of belief, and Eve of Adam, and both were beliefs of life and matter. We say beliefs because that is not the truth of being. Principle and not person, spirit and not matter, truth and not error, God and not man, made male and female. And the Lord said, Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good from evil. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and live forever. Therefore the Lord sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground whence he is taken. No one can doubt this scripture is allegorical, pointing out the results of a belief of God in man or intelligence in matter. We cannot accept it in a literal sense without impugning the love that made man and gave him earth for possession and blessed it for his sake. A literal acceptance of this quotation implies malice, withholding from man the opportunity to reform lest he should become better. But this is not our God, and so contrary to love and wisdom, we must accept it only as the pagan opinions of those rewriting the inspired word. The true interpretation of the scripture is its spiritual sense. Beginning in person instead of principle to explain God, we express him after the manner of man, the nature of personal sense, and on the basis of error instead of truth, drawing all our conclusions from a material instead of spiritual standpoint, hence the discord, theoretically and practically, that follows a belief of intelligent matter. Behold, the man is become as one of us. Error and not the truth of being said that. Man is not God, therefore he did not become as one of us. Intelligence is not in matter, therefore it is not personal sense. Spirit and matter would make God mortal man, and intelligence and life person instead of principle, and body instead of soul. That this error be not reckoned truth, or as one of us, and claimed the prerogative of intelligence. God said, "Let all that produces sickness, sin, and death," till the ground, that is, be understood as proceeding from a material and not a spiritual basis, and therefore an air that returns to dust, primitive nothingness. Let material things be understood forever as apart from the spiritual. Think not to blend matter and spirit, for this is not the science of being, and will result in discord and death. From the sweat of the brow to derive life or happiness started with Adam. Air, it was from the tree of knowledge, so unlike the harmony and immortality of man created by spirit. Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth, is the better understanding of life. Whatsoever proceedeth from spirit is harmonious and immortal. Deriving it all is from God. But what cometh from matter is mortal, dependent on sense instead of soul. Material man and a world of matter reverse the science of being and are utterly false. Nothing is right about them. Their starting point is error. Illusion, therefore sin and sense, are at home in this world, and mortal error stalks boldly forth on firm footing until the waiting hand of science shall strike it down. Truth has literally no foothold on such an earth, and with such views, for they accord neither place nor privilege to God. Error tills the entire ground here, working on a material platform. Therefore wisdom said, "Let Adam err," that is, not the image and likeness of God, not the immortal mind reflecting harmonious intelligence, but a belief of life and intelligence in matter, be set apart from the immortal, that is the idea of truth. For this is the science of being, that spirit and matter, which is truth and error, never blend. Instead of the life, truth, etc., that make man harmonious, immortal, the belief or error, named Adam, depends on personality and pardon, like a vain child that demands to be blessed when it must be punished, because it knows not the terms on which a blessing is gained, but in its blindness expects from matter and personality the good that comes from spirit and truth. If God hath made Adam and sin, they must have been good, for all was good that he made. The translators of that record wrote it in the air of being, to wit, the belief of life and intelligence in matter. Hence their misinterpretation. They spoke from air, of air, and from the standpoint of matter attempted to define spirit, which accounts for the contradiction in that glorious old record of creation. Science in no instance has a material basis. Matter and personality are not man, neither God intelligence. Belief is all that claims spirit and matter, and would make personalities of air and truth, naming one mortal man and the other God. That God is a person, or intelligence in matter, and man another intelligence of evil, is knowledge prohibited by wisdom. It was not the tree of life. Truth had but one reply to all this error: thou shalt surely die. Therefore, mortality attends every phase of the supposed life and matter, whether mineral, vegetable, or animal. Whatever germinates after the manner of matter will meet the fate of air, namely sickness, sin, and death, until every vestige of this belief is self-destroyed, and man understood, the shadow and not substance, whose only life or intelligence is God. So he drove out the man, and placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword, which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. Here is a clear and distinct separation of Adam, air, from harmony and truth, wherein soul and sense, person and principle, spirit and matter are forever separate. The figure used in the New Testament of the wise men coming from the east was employed here, also, and prefigured the sun that symbolized soul, even the principle of man, therefore the wisdom of man. The sword of truth is represented as two-edged, cutting each way to protect from error, or the belief of life in matter. Also, the tree of life symbolized the truth of being, and the tree of knowledge, air or personal man. Truth also guarded Eden, harmony, and the science of being pointed the way of happiness in life. Error alone was sickness, sin, and death, because it was a belief that matter is intelligence and evil a person named Satan, working in and against man. The tree of life was guarded from the touch of mortality because it symbolized the truth of man, and between this truth and the opposite error was placed the metaphorical word, or flaming warning, to hold them forever apart, showing that truth and error, or spirit and matter, never mingle. The great point in the science of being is to learn that spirit and matter never unite or dwell together, but are the wheat and tar that grow side by side until the harvest, when matter is destroyed, and God learned our only real being. The infancy of this science is lisping to an unconscious age the great truth of being and perceiving one idea and not its correlative one. Many will call that science, which is only a portion of it, and again, it is difficult in this evil world to do as well as we know. If mathematics present 1,000 different examples and one of them proves the rule laid down for the others are not all equally authenticated. When a single statement of this science is proved, it settles the question for the others. All are dependent on one and vice versa. One cannot be disproved without disuniting the general chain through which the principle is reached. Hence the command not to add or diminish one word to that which is inspired and demonstrable, but which personal sense cannot explain. And Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and brought forth Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. This record implies a new creation commenced after God had finished. His work, that wisdom, was entering into partnership with man to create anew the whole human family. But the beauty, sublimity, and science of the record is lost sight of there. If we enter this labyrinth of inconsistencies, unconscious, it is the record of error opposed to the truth of being. Adam was a metaphor, showing the opposite of God's creation, and the original texts were written metaphorically at first, the only method of reaching the science of the Scripture. Hence, the truth of the Bible is to raise to its spiritual interpretation, then compare its saying and gain their general tenor, which enables us to reach the ascending scale of being through demonstration, as did prophet and apostle. The Scripture seems more obscure in Genesis and Revelations and other portions, solely because the original texts were not understood by those rewriting them. 300 years after the apostles, there was not a written text of the New Testament. It had to be taken up at first orally. The record of creation given in the first chapter of Genesis is the science and truth of being. But the opposite statement in the second chapter, where man sprang from dust instead of deity, is error's statement, even personal sense speaking in sin, sickness, and death that would confine life to matter conditions and limit omnipotence. In this error and belief, the herb is not created without seed and soil, and man is the product of an egg. The first record embraces the principle of harmonious man, even the truth of being, and the second, the origin of the belief of life and matter, which belief embraces also sickness, sin, and death, all that is mortal. To admit God made man of dust and afterwards breathed intelligence into matter, and it became a living soul, is rank atheism that would submerge supreme wisdom in the things it created. This statement of man and God makes both mortal. In Adam all died, and in Christ shall all be made alive. The truth of being casts out error, heals the sick, and raises the dead. Understanding life exempt from mortality and no sensation or intelligence in the body is the ultimatum of being, the way, the truth, and life that points out the four footsteps of science. Life is not in matter unless truth is in matter. Life is God, as the Scriptures declare, and God never germinated. He is the same today, yesterday, and forever outside of all he creates, and the creator of all. If God breathed into the body, into matter, wisdom, then matter became spirit, and the stronger rules out the weaker, and matter is God. Error claimed this when it said, I will make you as gods, but truth replied to this belief, thou shalt die. Life, truth, and love never formed their image and likeness of dust, nor breathed into dust matter, truth, and love. We should naturally shrink from the error and belief if it were only understood, error presupposing another God, or that the Supreme Being entered man that he made, and that matter embraces God. The statement that God made man of matter and that he put himself in the personal sense in sin should be understood that the very opposite of the truth of being. And if this was so understood, sin, sickness, and death would disappear. Error makes man a slave to matter, but this error came from knowledge and was mortal. Truth gave man immortality and dominion over matter. The mist that went up from the ground, causing it to produce, was figurative of the belief that matter germinates, and man's life is matter instead of spirit. This belief takes the explanation of man out of the bands of science, wherein man is the product of spirit, and gives it to personal sense, denying the express declaration of God that man was made the image and likeness of spirit. Truth said, partake not of this knowledge, it is error, denouncing it as fatal, but error replied oppositely, in the day ye eat thereof ye shall become as gods. That is, there shall be more than one intelligence, For matter shall be permeated with spirit, brains, nerves, etc., shall be intelligent of good and evil, and pain and pleasure, life and death shall be mixed and named personal sense. We cannot fail to see the great contradiction between the spiritual creation of the universe and man, and the so called material creation of these through Darwinian evolution or propagation. Mortal and material man is purely mythical. This man started from what? The ground? That is, his basis was matter, and woman was evolved from this man, mythologically stated. She came from his rib. Afterwards, male and female physically were made the foundations of man, making races and an egg at the author of being. But this evolution or Darwin theory is false. There is no life and intelligence in matter passing and alike from vegetable, mineral, and animal, hearing the while wisdom's denunciation. So unlike the blessings and honor bestowed on man's origin and spirit, and the offspring of God. Immortal man was sustained by spirit, the mortal by matter and the sweat of his brow. One held life and soul, the other in sense. One was good and blessed, the other accursed. A misconception of man pervades the whole statement of mortal or material man from his origin in dust until he returns thither. His entire history is the origin and end of air, not man. I have gotten a man from the Lord was a falsehood from the beginning, for this man was a foul murderer. And truth and love never created hatred and sin. Supreme harmony never produced the atom and his progeny. That which is not God or his idea is not only evil and mortal, but unreal, yea, illusion. A wrong version of the scriptures has hidden their truth. The prophet Isaiah is recorded to have said, God creates peace and he makes evil. But turn to Jeremiah and you find this contradicted. Jesus also takes the opposite ground for the basis of his demonstration, showing that God casts out sin, sickness, and death instead of creating them. What would we say of the musician whose harmony produced discord? Science gets right these knotty points and renders to God the things that are his. We learn error by its result. Sickness, sin, and death are the fruits of error. Truth gives harmony and immortality. Thus wisdom adjusted it. And thou shalt die was not spoken in vain, and what purports to be life, substance and intelligence and matter, God and man and soul and body. Adam made of dust was not the image or likeness of God. Spirit, therefore, partaking of knowledge, never lost his first estate, but was the result of it. Man, originating in God, never fell into sin or death. He is forever happy, harmonious, and immortal, inheriting this birthright alone from spirit. The so-called man that is sinning, sick, and dying is not man, but a dream of life, an intelligence in matter, dust to dust, nothingness. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod, and Cain knew his wife, etc. This second fabulous creation originated man first in dust, woman in a rib, and the rest of humanity in an egg.
Okay. Her drives were no longer a recreation for Mrs. Eddy in any sense of the word. She went forth on them with an iron determination to show the world that the stories whispered about Mary Baker Eddy were only lies. Once she said to a new secretary who found her painfully trying to draw her gloves on her shaking hands, Miss Dickey, I want you to know it does me good to go on this drive. I do not mean that the physical going for a drive does me good, but the enemy have made a law that it hurt me to go on this drive, and they are trying to enforce it. Despite her heroic and magnificent efforts to overcome the malicious animal magnetism of the enemy, to conquer the body that had always served her so poorly, and to combat the constant renewal of the rumors about her earthly presence, these whispers were repeated in ever increasing volume, and credence great with the repetition. By 1908, numerous loyal Christian scientists themselves had become convinced that Mary Baker Eddy was actually no more, and that only a designing board of directors was endeavoring to maintain the fiction of her existence. There is an abundant evidence to indicate that Mrs. Stetson herself came to credit these rumors, so often were they reiterated. She herself had no direct contact with Mrs. Eddy for perhaps a year, and she now realized that the board of directors in Boston themselves believed that there must shortly be a struggle for power between the board and herself. She had no way of knowing positively whether Mrs. Eddy were in mental stupor or denying or dying by degrees, or perhaps dead and buried, but she was at least certain that the founder had last laid down her leadership. And Mrs. Stetson had no intention of allowing this leadership to pass into any hands but her own. Accordingly, in 1908, in the November of 1908, she and her church announced to the press that they intended to build on Riverside Drive in New York, a branch church of the First Church of Christ Science, and that would exceed a magnificence anything which Christian Science had yet demonstrated. It would be even larger and more costly than the mother church and annex in Boston. It was Mrs. Stetson's first open move to make herself and New York church supreme in Christian Science world. Neither Mrs. Eddy nor her board could read this announcement with any feeling but horror. Only the mother church was permitted to have branches. Augusta's announcement that she was going to organize a branch for her own temple could only mean that war was now declared and that the rebellion was on. Mrs. Eddy was in a strange quandary. Obviously, the situation called for prompt action, but undoubtedly she was distraught with fear, not merely fear that she was at last to be outed in her old age from the position of leadership in which she had fought for a lifetime to establish herself, but an even more personal fear of her physical safety. Her horror of malicious animal magnetism and its unknown possibilities, if it should be directed toward her by the dynamic Augusta Stetson, had become a dominant force. Meanwhile, as she nervously pondered, Archibald McLeland, editor-in-chief, inserted the following editorial in the Sentinel of December 5th. One Mother Church in Christian Science. A newspaper of November 30th announces, on information said to have been received from the First Church of Christ Scientists of New York City, that it is proposed to have a church edifice rivaling the beauty of architecture or any other religious structure in America. Mrs. Eddy is known to be profoundly pleased at this new evidence of growth and prosperity in the church of which she is founder. It was learned last night that Christian Scientists here have aspired to build another and more splendid edifice, even since the Boston Christian Scientists erected the $2 million Mother Church. Concerning these new items, it is to be said that Mrs. Eddy was not known to be profoundly pleased with what purported to be plans of First Church of Christ Scientists of New York, for she learned of this proposal rival of the Mother Church for the first time from the daily press. Three leading facts remain immortal in the history of Christian Science, namely, one, the science is already established and it was the support of all true Christian scientists throughout the world. Two, any competitive or rivalry in Christian Science is abnormal and will expose and explode. Three, any attempt at rivalry or superiority in Christian Science is unchristian, therefore it is unscientific. In many of our large cities, when a congregation has outgrown its church buildings, then other branch churches are organized and a new edifice erected to accommodate the increasing numbers. But each branch at each moment at once becomes an individual church and has immediate connection with the mother church, so that the later organizations are as directly attached to the parent vine as they are of the earlier branches. The members of each new organization are in no way connected or affiliated with their former church. Were one branch church to depend upon a neighboring branch, far training and supporting this action would tend to sever its connection with the mother church. The essential condition for fruit bearing is undivided attachment to the present vine. On the other hand, no branch church, however large, is privileged to oversee or supervise another branch. Side by side with this editorial was another one, also signed by the editor-in-chief. It said, among other things, "Are you striving in Christian Science to be the best Christian on earth, or are you striving to have the most costly edifice on earth? The more modest and less imposing material superstructures indicate a spiritual state of thought, and vice versa. Vice versa." At that moment, the writer appears to have remembered some of the things that were being said about Mrs. Eddy's luxurious new abode, with a particular reference to its very material elegance, for he immediately swept into the following paragraph. The house which Mrs. Eddy now occupies is large that she needs because she could not find exactly what she wanted, but it is plain house and its furnishings are not extravagant. Miss Eddy was declared against the display of material things and has said that the less we have of them, the better, since God has taught her that matter is unreal and spirit is the only reality. Any other position would be unscientific. It is obvious that McLeland was undertaking a burden which Mrs. Eddy never assumed, that of striving for consistency. Mrs. Eddy herself thought about the astonishing church situation for quite a while, and then leisurely wrote the comment which appears 6 weeks later in the Sentinel. I have crowned the Mother Church building with the spiritual modesty of Christian Science, which is its jewel. When my dear brethren in New York desire to build higher, to enlarge their physicalities, and demonstrate Christian Science to a higher extent, they must begin on the holy spiritual foundation, then which is no other, and proportionate estimate their success and glory of achievement only as they build up the rock of Christ, the spiritual foundation. Mrs. Eddy obviously hesitated to make her words too harsh. The thought must have occurred to her that it would be wise generalship to play for time and meanwhile sound up the depths of various possibilities. As always, in the face of calamity, she never herself she nerved herself to energetic action. Thus, she sent a letter to Mrs. Stetson on December 7th, exactly a week after the first newspaper announcement, and 2 days after Mr. McLeland's denunciation of the New York church had appeared in the Sentinel. My beloved student, I have tried and hoped all through the past season to have you come to me and take a drive with me around the Chestnut Hill Reservoir, but I failed Hithrow too. If the reason was not too far advanced for Mrs. Stetson to enjoy such a drive, Mrs. Eddy asked that she designate a day and hour, adding that she usually took her drive between 1 and 2 o'clock of an afternoon. She signed the letter, lovingly yours. Never was there a more disarming document. No one will ever know the mixed emotions which Mrs. Stetson felt when this letter came to her by post. It was typewritten, but it was concluded with a signature and appeared veritably Mrs. Eddy's own. It was like a voice from the grave. Mrs. Stetson immediately got on a night train, went to Boston, and let Fry know she was there as soon as she got off the Pullman in the morning. Mrs. Eddy sent back a note to the Touraine, which Mrs. Stetson always made her Boston headquarters. It was very brief. It simply asked Mrs. Stetson to come to Chestnut Hill at 1 o'clock that afternoon for a short drive. This time, however, she noted was the note was in Mrs. Eddy's own hand. It was unmistakably authentic. Mrs. Stetson went out to Chestnut Hill with her heart in her mouth. She arrived promptly at the hour set. She remembered only too well Mrs. Eddy's love for absolute promptness. Mrs. Stetson, in turn, had exacted the same tribute from her own students. She was informed when she rang the bell that Mrs. Eddy was already in her carriage in that porte cochere. Mrs. Eddy Mrs. Eddy by this time had installed another elevator which took her down from the second floor apartment director to the carriage entrance. She was thus enabled to take her daily drive with a minimum of strain. The day was cold, and her attendants had wrapped around her a white lamb wool blanket, putting over the soft cover a heavy and dark rug. It would not have been strange as Mrs. Stetson stood there if she had been at a momentary loss of words, but Augusta Stetson, like Mrs. Eddy, was a woman of many resources. She stepped into the carriage, and Mrs. Eddy took both her hands, kissed her, and said how glad she was to see her dear student. When Mrs. Stetson was seated, Fry made a move to cover her with the dark rug that Mrs. Eddy shared. Remove that, instructed Mrs. Eddy, and put Augusta under the white robe with me. Mrs. Stetson protested that the carriage rug was quite sufficient. No, Mrs. Eddy answered, I want you to share this with me. Thus was reestablished the old atmosphere of intimacy that Mrs. Eddy at the moment so greatly desired. They drove for 3/4 of an hour. No record of the actual conversation during the drive exists, but there can be small doubt from Mrs. Stetson's subsequent accounts of the incident that Mrs. Eddy in every sentence carefully probed. What she wanted was information. Since she was never a keen judge of character, she could not be sure whether Augusta was also playing a part or was sincere in maintaining that old deferential manner of loyal student to cherished teacher. As for Augusta, she perhaps remembered a time when she told a member of her board of trustees, you will never see Mrs. Eddy again. Perhaps she remembered how she had previously proclaimed that Mrs. Eddy would be immortal and how, like Peter, she had then lost faith. As she sat there beside Mrs. Eddy on this chill December afternoon, Augusta Stetson's soul must have burned with her. At any rate, she never ceased after that day to proclaim that Mary Baker Eddy was immortal, and for her, indeed, Mrs. Eddy had actually come back from the grave. Mrs. Stetson made compensation, too. For Mrs. Eddy, this drive was undoubtedly a calculated move to learn firsthand just how far Mrs. Stetson had carried her plans in conspiring to bring rebellion and secession into the church that she herself had sought so hard and long to make inviolable. One may imagine her with trembling fingers and a voice that faltered with eager nervousness, despite her very effort to control it, endeavoring to learn the worst, steering the talk casually from topic to topic, chatting intimately, discussing her household, asking finally about Augusta's own affairs, striving with every word to peer beneath the mask of affectionate humility which Augusta wore with such aplomb. And she could discover nothing with protestations of love and reference. Mrs. Stetson denied that she ever meant to do what the newspapers had reported. She was planning only to create a new branch, not for her own church, but for Mrs. Eddy's own mother church. It was to have been another monument for Mrs. Eddy, for Mary Baker Eddy, the most glorious monument in marble that had yet been erected. But the newspapers had discovered these plans while the whole thing was only under consideration. They had written ignorant stories full of lies. The newspaper always lies, Mrs. Eddy herself knew why they lied. They were always motivated only by malicious animal magnetism. Oh, dearest, this is such a lie. No one knows us can believe this. Thus Augusta have protested, full of horror, with every thought of how greatly she had erred, how tremendously she had sinned in her momentary weakness when she doubted the existence of her immortal leader. No one will ever know whether she confessed this error to Mrs. Eddy as they drove that afternoon for 3/4 of an hour, but she did make a promise. The project for a new church in New York would be dropped immediately. Since the newspaper had so terribly misrepresented it, Augusta would abandon the idea completely. Okay, let's listen. Science and Health.
Up to that, no mention was made of another woman save Eve, the mother of Cain. Eve in the Hebrew signifies beginning, and the question is naturally suggested, whence came the wife of Cain? This, however, is unimportant in the evolution of matter, whereby intelligence and man are supposed to be developed, subject to propagation, growth, and depth. This false theory or Adamic error was ruled out from the presence of God, truth, to dwell in the land of Nod, the land of dreams and illusion. Error, named Adam, was the foundation of this mythical creation, and the belief still continues, namely that man is matter, hence the image of God mortal. Spirit created all things. Man created from matter is mythological, with dust a rib and Cain's mother for his wife. Alas, who shall say that a monkey was not our great-great-grandfather? Far be it from us, with thought of expression, to touch profanely the glorious record of the Bible, where alone we may gain the understanding of man's immortal basis, and meager were all earth's possessions, disinherited of the inspired page. But the understanding of Scripture is what we need to restore the harmony of being and gain its principle, the Father's house, where the prodigal returns and the perfection of man appears. Christ said, "Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father in me, else believe me for my work's sake." That is, understand that I am intelligence and not matter, and that intelligence is God. There is no evil intelligence, else believe this for the demonstration it brings, healing the sick and casting out error. We cannot doubt the inspiration that opened to us the spiritual sense of the Bible when it lifted us from disease and death, giving us triumph over the body, standing at the threshold of scientific being, and there beholding the falsity of earthly things. The Spirit and bride say, "Come, and whosoever will, let him drink of the waters of life freely." Humbly, as fervently, we join grateful issue with the truth of being that separates Adam, air, forever from the presence of God, and says to the body, no personal sense, no life, intelligence, or substance and matter. In the atmosphere or mind of soul, man has seen the image and likeness of goodness and perfection, and cannot lose this estate. He being the only heir to the abundant affluence of life, truth, and love, that said, "Let us make man in our own image." Mortal and material man is simply a belief of life and matter. We say a belief because he is not the reality of man, and never can reach life that is outside of matter, where alone is our real, because of our harmonious being. Looking and thinking from a material point only, we never shall gain the science of being. In the dark ourselves, how can we see the darkness or the light even? The belief of sin and sickness, or of death or life and matter, hides man's life and harmony. That is soul and not sense. But who will believe our report, to whom the arm of the Lord hath not been revealed? The sun, that is light and heat, gives little warmth or brightness until the clouds pass from before us. Thus, the science of being is seen only as sense is hushed and life is learned spiritually. Every agony of mortal man wafts him onward over the billows until air is finally destroyed and there is no more sea. This is a new birth, the travail of air before it is self-destroyed, and man is born of spirit and not matter. In the allegory in Genesis, air said, "Believe me, I will make you as gods." But truth replied to this belief, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." The first intimation of sickness, sorrow, and man's tyranny came with the belief of life and intelligence in matter. "My son, give me thy heart," restores concord to all the dependencies and relationships of being. Our master's impotent fears were the world of sense, but he feared them not. That which killed the body, but was not able to destroy soul, the life and principle of man, had no terrors for him. Treating of the growth of eggs, Professor Agassiz said, "It is very possible that many general statements current now about birth and generation will be changed with the progress of information. Had the great naturalist gained through his tireless researches the scientific basis of being independent of growth and organization, the blessing of that ardent mind would have continued longer with us. History is greatly indebted to his labors and genius for facts relating to the belief of life and matter. His discoveries brought to light important points in what is termed embryonic life, the butterfly, bee, etc., propagating their species without the male element, and this corroborates science, proving plainly that the origin of the universe and man depends not on material conditions. The spiritual understanding of life embraces neither sensuous formations nor conditions of matter. All that had a beginning has an end. What we name life germinating in an egg and expanding thence to adult's being will finally go out, which proves it never was life and nothing in fact but the belief of life, and this belief, mesmerism and not man. Animals of lower organisms combine three methods of reproduction. They multiply by eggs, buds, and self-division, proving the conditions of life become less imperative in lower organisms, or where there is less mind and belief on the subject. Professor Agassiz said, "Successive generations do not begin with the birth of new individuals, but with the formation of the egg whence these individuals proceed, and we must look upon the egg as a starting point of the complicated structure of man." His deep researches into material structure culminate here in logical conclusion, and with less hypothesis and more observation than generally attend such theorems. His discovery aids the science of life. He has bearded air in its den, proved clearly the origin of mortal man to be matter and not spirit, the product of an egg instead of God, and that a belief of structural life is the sole progenitor of what is termed mortal man, even as truth is the origin of mortal man in the universe. But what availeth it to investigate this so-called life that germinates, matures, and decays, that is found to end, even as it begins, a nameless nothing, starting in dust or an egg, and ending in dust? This belief in error, the source of sickness, sin, and death, hides the real harmony of life. When it is learned that God is our life, man will be immortal, sinless, and perfect, and never until then. Spirit is without beginning, without end, but admitting the false premise of life and matter, whence to draw our conclusions of man, we may infer the discord and confusion consequent on this error and belief with but one signification: dust to dust. Error of thought leads to error of action. A constant contemplation of sin will produce it, and the ever-present belief of existence in matter drops the standard of man in dust. Contemplate life as it is, neither man nor matter, but God, that which is intelligence, purity, and harmony, and we gain its happiness. If life has a starting point, immortality is a myth. Commencing at a given point signifies and terminates. If life has a beginning, it has an end also, and there is no immortality. Life is spherical, without beginning or end. The form of the globe typifies it, and the principle of the universe is life, truth, and love. Life is cause and not effect, universal, infinite, omnipotent, producing all that really is, and never inside its production. An egg were a narrow boundary for God, and matter cannot produce matter, much less can it produce spirit, or spirit permeate matter. For spirit to enter matter would be to destroy it, and all would be found spirit. The immortal destroys mortality, and death would be swallowed up in life. That like produces like is not only true in homeopathy, but holds good in the science of being. Embryology affords no instance of one species producing another, of a serpent germinating a bird, or a lion a lamb. This would be gathering grapes of thorns and figs of thistles. Such amalgamation would be deemed monstrous and out of the order of things. A pure fountain sendeth not forth impure streams, and vice versa. Then how can spirit germinate matter, the holy, the unholy, and the immortal mortality? The difference is not as great between the opposite species as between matter and spirit, so utterly unlike in substance and intelligence. That spirit propagates matter or matter spirit is morally impossible. Science repudiates the thought in personal sense alone, must father it, because it is unnatural, unreal, and impossible. Germinating intelligence is germinating God. How very absurd. Intelligence in matter would make matter the circumference of mind. Intelligence produces or is produced. Which is it? Is matter first and mind afterward? Matter, the primogenitor of mind, or does intelligence germinate non-intelligence? Like produces like. Intelligence is spirit that germinates idea and not matter. Therefore, matter is neither effect or cause. All is mind. Matter is but a belief and error. Natural history shows that each species produces its like, only the bird is not the father of the beast. The egg germinates the parent stock, and the seed the original plant. Hybrids are rapes upon nature and not the common order. Harmonious and immortal man is the offspring of intelligence, and the unerring and infinite understanding that said, "Let us make man," hence the scientific certainty of this continuance. All that is discordant is mortal and without principle or understanding. Mind produces mind. Intelligence produces the idea of intelligence, and the mortal and the material, the beliefs of belief. One is truth, the other error, one real, the other unreal. The material produces only the mortal. Its basis is belief and not truth. Professor Agassiz argues man springs from races. Mr. Darwin has it. He comes up through all the lower grades of being and must be a monkey before he can be a man. Mr. Darwin is right with regard to mortal man or matter, but should have made a distinction between these and the immortal, whose basis is spirit. Animality produces animals, and what is good and pure mingles not with evil or the impure. These are two diametrically opposite sources and results. The good comes from God, from spirit outside of matter. The evil is a belief of matter. Hence, the less material the belief, the more transparent mind is for God to shine through. For all that is pure is harmonious and eternal, and the more is God, the intelligent outside of matter, seen through man, but not from him. Matter cannot produce spirit, and vice versa. Truth cannot produce error. Therefore, it never made a mortal, sick, or sinful man, nor error a spiritual, harmonious, or immortal man. Error reflects error, and truth is reflected only by truth. Spirit gives forth only the image and likeness of itself, therefore the idea of God, pure and undefiled. A mortal and sinful man is the product of mortality and not of God, of error and not truth. Hence the scripture statement of him that he sprang from the ground, that is, from a material basis, and ours, that he is a belief only, an error. And Mr. Darwin's, that is, primogenitors, are beasts, and Professor Agassiz's, that he germinates from an egg. Our views will be accepted later than the others only because they are more spiritual. Professor Agassiz asked, what can there be of a material nature transmitted through these bodies called eggs, themselves composed of the simplest material elements, by which all peculiarities of ancestry belonging to either sex are either brought down from generation to generation? Here we see the darkness and doubt creeping into the great mind of the great naturalist because of the material base of his reasoning, starting from matter instead of God, for the basis of immortal man, who by searching can end out God. A student said to us, I understand your explanation of truth, but I cannot understand error. And why? Because he made it something and we nothing. He gave to error a local habitation and a name, making it what it is not, even an entity and power. There is no mortal man or reality to error. First, because man is immortal, and error is not the truth, or reality of being. Secondly, that these are neither God nor his idea. All that is real is eternal. Pains or pleasure of personal sense are unreal, and the so-called life of mortal man is a myth. The belief of life in matter is the so-called mind of man. that suffers because it is a belief of suffering, and dies because it is an error of belief. Searching into the origin of life is vain. No beginning or end hath life, for it is from everlasting and everlasting. Life is truth, and truth is life. Act brought to light through error, sickness, sin, and death. Truth is immortality, not immortality, for it is soul, not in sense and sin. If life starts in an egg, it matter and mortal, but matter cannot produce intelligence, whence there is mind. All is mind, there is no matter. Spirit destroys the belief of matter as truth destroys error. If possible for spirit God to enter into a body of sin and death, then harmony enters discord, and discord destroys harmony. Can good dwell in evil, or evil represent good? The poor logic and lack of truth that would blend spirit and matter, immortality and mortality, sin and goodness in one body, and call it man, was the error Jesus argued against as the foundation of all discord, showing its falsity by parable and proof. Christ, truth, casts out this error and heals the sick, beginning at once to destroy mortality with its own immortality. The wicked often return evil for good when the truth of being comes in contact with their error to destroy it. Therefore, the followers of Christ, truth, must love their enemies and go forth as lambs among wolves. The sick sometimes pass through severe suffering in the changes truth produces before it destroys the error, disease, and the chronic sinner. Or hidden hypocrite suffers from the introduction into his mind of the science of being and often hates its teacher. Man's immortality rests on a spiritual and not a material basis, and his health on soul and not sense. We have no foundation for man's immortality if the perfect is not distinct from the imperfect. And what evidence have we of God or perfection where we admit imperfection germinates from God? The good we are, the order, beauty, and loveliness we behold, all assure us God is life, truth, and love, and that matter embraces all error, while spirit is perfect. Spiritual science reveals all matter inanimate, while personal sense would make it both animate and evil. But which is the standard of truth, personal sense or science? That harmony, intelligence, and life are outside of matter, wholly apart and distinct from error and mortality. Even the leaf and flower, too, beautiful to die, declare. A consciousness of truth, life, and love is soul, not body. The psalmist saith, When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the star, which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hand. Thou hast put all things under his feet. Matter is as clouds, and the spirit the sun, that appears to us only as the clouds disappear. The sun is not in the cloud, but shines behind it. Thus it is with the soul of man, when the belief of substance or life and matter disappears. We take up existence as spirit, and our body is transparent to soul, and no longer a belief of substance, matter, or personal sense, but the idea of intelligence, harmony, and life. Truth separated Jesus, its idea, from the world of error, and the world of sense felt the effect of truth, because it was tearing away the foundations of error that could not understand the need there was of this. Hence the unappreciated labor and love of Jesus, the great demonstrator of the science of life. Had Jesus defended error, admitted his position, and justified them, he would have been the world's favorite. But this was impossible to him who chose his master of spirit. He could not destroy sickness with truth, that life is God, and be a stickler for personal sense and life and matter. Had he believed with them on this point, he would have mingled amicably with hypocrites and the sensuous man, and not rebuked them, and been hated for it. But hypocrisy was more repugnant to goodness and truth than other forms of evil. The fact that Christ was truth, error soon found out, and the world of personal sense hated Jesus, for he rebuked it, and chose not an ism or ology to define Christianity, or to aid him in its practice. Had he believed as others did, he would not have so suffered from the world, or had he preached better than he practiced, he would have mixed error with error, and no chemical change or separation from the world would have followed his preaching. But he could not and would not cast out devils with Beelzebub. He might have been a popular man on this common begs, but then he could not have been a Christian. He might have been talked well and not been good enough for that goodness to prove itself by making war on error, and he would have passed for a good man. The world of sense and error felt him, for he was destroying it. Those whom he blessed cursed him, yet he loved his enemies, and while they thought of him only to condemn, his better thoughts answered theirs, healing them of sickness and casting out their error. Such was the effect of his mind on all it touched, whether enemy or friend, and such will be the effect on mankind of every real follower of Christ. His mind, pure and spiritual, touched theirs to higher issues and restored harmony to the body. He knew that like produces like, and that his higher being in contact with others changed and lifted them higher. That truth germinates truth, and spirit imparts spirituality and not materiality. This was the science and the principle of his consistent demonstration that healed the sick and cast out error. Any hypothesis of birth and death is unworthy intelligence. What is real is eternal, eliminated and sustained by spirit alone, that matter cannot express, and much less control or destroy. All the formations of God are based on spirit and immortality, and that which is formed by soul and not sense is harmless, harmonious, and eternal. Heaven and earth, together with every animal, mineral, and vegetable that God hath made, are harmonious and eternal. The belief of life in matter produces its own kind, for it is predicated on error that brings forth that which is sinful, ferocious, impure, and mortal. Vertebrates, articulates, mollusks, and radiates are simply what mind makes them. They are technicalized mortality that will disappear when the radiates of spirit illumine sense and destroy forever the belief of life and intelligence in matter. The voice of Christian science crieth in the wilderness today, with scarcely an adherent on earth, but we also know it is preparing the way for the principle of being to be understood, and its demonstration given that casts out error and heals the sick. Death brings not at once spiritualization, nor is it the stepping stone to a distant day or final judgment when a personal God shall pass sentence on man. The sentence of truth against error is already passed. Every loss and experience of the falsity on earthly things pronounce it. Death.
Okay, let's finish the reading. On hearing this, Mrs. Eddy's heart must have trembled with joy. She could not possibly desire anything more. For the moment, at least, her leadership and her organization were safe. Whatever Augusta's real intentions and ambitions might be, an open break could for a while be averted. No matter what the future might hold, catastrophe was temporarily postponed. There was still time for Mrs. Eddy to save her church. The drive ended and the two returned to the house. Mrs. Eddy was helped directly into the elevator from her carriage and was taken upstairs. Mrs. Stetson, meanwhile, entered the house and went into the drawing room. Mrs. Eddy removed her wraps, took a chair, and sent for Mrs. Stetson to come up. Despite her feeling of assurance that all was still well, she wanted to make doubly sure. Augusta came into the room, radiant now and poised. Mrs. Eddy looked at her searchingly and once more felt safe. How healthy and strong you are, Mrs. Eddy exclaimed enviously. They said goodbye, and Augusta was downstairs again to be met by Mr. Dickey, the secretary, who offered to show her Mrs. Eddy's private reception room, where a number of more lavish presents sent to the mother had been arranged. Mrs. Eddy, by 1905, had collected so many presents that, in a mood of sudden decision, she issued a notice forbidding her followers to send her any more Christmas gifts. This was a great relief to the servants in Mrs. Eddy's house, but the order puzzled the church congregation, many of whom interpreted it as a ban on Christmas giving in general. Had they been able to see Mrs. Eddy's museum, they would have understood. Into Mrs. Eddy's feeling of gratification as she sat in her study, there must have kept a flicker of doubt, for she rang for Mrs. Dickey, asked if Mrs. Stetson had left, and said she wished to see Augusta again. Mrs. Stetson entered the room, approached her leader, dropped suddenly to her knees before the low chair in which Mrs. Eddy was sitting. Involuntarily almost, Augusta bowed her head. Mrs. Eddy took both of Augusta's hands in hers, and for a few moments was silent. Now she knew. Now she had no remaining doubt that her mother church, her hierarchy, was safe. This is the happiest day of my life on earth, she said, and paused. And then slowly, with ecstasy, is every word, God bless you forever and forever and forever. Mrs. Eddy waved her head. It was a signal for Augusta to go. As she approached the door of the room in which she thought she had been alone with her leader, she saw Mrs. Dickey and Mrs. Sargent standing together besides the door like sentinels. Only at that moment did a little wonder stir within her. Never before had she had a personal interview with Mrs. Eddy except when they had been alone. The two sentinels swung the door open silently. Mrs. Eddy would never see Augusta Stetson again. Mrs. Stetson went back to New York. She told her board of trustees merely that the general sensation which resulted from the announcement of the new building plans made it wise to abandon the entire project. The board agreed with her. The board always agreed with Mrs. Stetson. Public announcement of the change in plan did not refer to Mrs. Stetson's talk with Mrs. Eddy. Indeed, Mrs. Stetson addressed her announcement to Mrs. Eddy personally, just as if the old lady had never heard the news. It was a letter meant primarily for public consumption, with an induction so phrased that the ordinary reader would be led to assume that the whole news had just broken in the papers. Mrs. Stetson was writing on December 14th, 1908, 2 weeks after the World published its sensational story, 9 days after Mr. McLeland's denunciation in the Sentinel, and 5 days after she had her personal interview with Mrs. Eddy. And she said, "My precious leader, lest you may have seen the reports of New York press in regarding to the contemplated new branch of your church, the First Church of Christ Scientist, Boston, Massachusetts, which was to have been formed from an overflow of First Church of Christ Scientists in New York City. I am writing you a true statement of facts, and they occur as they occurred." There were almost 1,000 words more and a poem. The poem began, "Build the more stately mansions, oh my soul," but the announcement that Mrs. Stetson and her board of trustees would abandon their building project came entirely too late to save Augusta Stetson. Mrs. Eddy had already made up her mind. Augusta was not to be trusted for another moment. There was only one problem to be solved: how to get rid of her safely. The board of directors of the Mother Church agreed with Mrs. Eddy fully. They felt that their position, their power as their natural heirs to the control of the great church, were in serious jeopardy. With the suit to determine Mrs. Eddy's sanity still unsettled, and Mrs. Eddy's death a possibility at any moment, the directors realized that they faced a hazardous future. They knew that Augusta Stetson would try to seize control of the church the instant Mrs. Eddy disappeared from the scene. If they hoped to avert this grim eventuality, they must get rid of Augusta Stetson before anything happened to Mrs. Eddy. They had indeed seen this necessity approaching over a period of several years, but there was no longer time to delay. With their church already under fire from every side, they indeed felt that they would have tremendous task following Mrs. Eddy's demise to pull the organization together without also having to face a civil war with Mrs. Stetson and her numerous loyal supporters. In consequence, rumors began to reach Mrs. Stetson that the board of directors meant to take from her the church she had spent her life building, and they were seeking a way to destroy her influence and to cast her out from the church entirely. Mrs. Stetson was inclined to be incredulous. She looked back upon the long years of devoted association with Mrs. Eddy, recalled the innumerable expressions of love and confidence which Mrs. Eddy had directed to her, and remembered that Mrs. Eddy was still alive. She could not see how the Boston board could succeed in its design. She was well aware that she had no friends among the church officials in Boston, but she needed no friends there if Mrs. Eddy was on her side. She counted on her leader with a whole heart. If ever a doubt came to her, she had only to remember Mrs. Eddy's parting words in that last talk: "God bless you forever and forever and forever." Serene in her renewed faith in the leader, Mrs. Stetson felt secure, and then suddenly, unwittingly, she gave Mrs. Eddy and the Boston board the very opportunity they were so eagerly seeking, an opportunity to slide her smoothly out of the church on doctrinal grounds. In February of 1909, Mrs. Stetson had written to one of her students, "The day is nearly over, the time for the Sunday evening services at hand. Everything is so quiet. There seems to be something strange impending." It hung on until July. Late in the afternoon of Friday, July 9th, a group of Mrs. Stetson's practitioners had an idea. They would make her a present of gold. Needless to say, the earnings of the practitioners of the First Church were large. They thus had every reason to feel indebted to Mrs. Stetson because of very tangible blessings. When all had contributed to the money collection, it occurred to them that their gratitude could not be fully expressed unless they also sent a personal note. They wrote a composite letter, which Mrs. Stetson received the next morning with a box containing the money. Probably malicious animal magnetism was working overtime against Mrs. Stetson at that moment, for a reading of the fond expression of gratitude in the composite letter brought to her the idea that she ought to send both the letter and the money to Mrs. Eddy. It was Mrs. Eddy, after all, who had made it possible for Augusta Stetson to become a teacher and preacher to men. It was Mrs. Eddy who should really receive the gift of this praise. The fact that Mrs. Stetson sent this gift to Mrs. Eddy, seen in retrospect, seems so foolhardy as to appear utterly unreasoned. When Mrs. Stetson did not know was that her arch antagonist was not the board director of the First Church of Christ Scientists. It was silent, watchful, fearful old woman whose opportunity had now come. In forwarding the money and the tributes to the 25 practitioners, Mrs. Stetson wrote her leader, "They were sent to me as expressions of love, gratitude the day before our communion service. I feel they belong to you, dearest, and are your fruit, for without your divine instruction and Christly guidance, I should not have had them. So I sent this copy of the dear letters to you with the type of gold of human character which is fast melting into spiritual understanding in each of these students. You asked me years ago this question, Augusta, lovest thou me? I answer, yes, beloved leader, I love you. Again, you repeat the query, lovest thou me? And against I replied, yes, I love you, my leader, teacher, and guide to eternal life. Then you said, feed my sheep. I have earnestly and prayerfully endeavored to do this. These are thine, Holy One. I trust they are all strong in Christ. May none fall away. They desire to honor you, our great forever leader. They have come up out of the great tribute and have washed their robes. Precious leader, my love for you is inexpressible. God grant my constant prayer that I may be worthy to call your faithful, obedient, loving child. As these excerpts show, it was obviously a letter written in a state of exalted religious ecstasy. Harried by ridicule, Mary Baker Eddy had withdrawn all possible claims to divinity, but there was at least one who now came to her and said, Holy One, my love for you is inexpressible. There was no humility in Mary Baker Eddy's eyes as she gazed. She turned from the tribute to her and scanned the enclosure, the tribute from the practitioners to Augusta Stetson. The practitioners had evidently written with the thought uppermost in mind that communion service was only 2 days away. Somehow they had taken the transubstantial theory and had gotten it mixed up with Mrs. Stetson. One practitioner, for instance, had said, your unselfish life, fast approaching the perfect idea of love, is to my hungry sense for truth, the beard of heaven and the water of life. Eating this bread is the bread of heaven and the water of life. Eating this bread and drinking this water is to me eating the body of Christ and drinking his blood. As Mrs. Eddy held the paper in her shaking hands and read these words which deified August as a Christus, she felt that her long-awaited opportunity had come. Here was evidence that provided doctrinal grounds to assure that Mrs. Stetson a perfect exit. So Stetson thought she was Jesus Christ, did she? The director displayed firm orders received from Mrs. Eddy. Act and act quickly. Handle these letters according to Science and Health and the Mother Church Manual. To Mrs. Stetson, Mrs. Eddy dictated a letter that was a masterpiece of self-restraint. She said, I have just finished reading your interesting letter. I thank you for acknowledging me as your leader, and I know that every true follower of Christian Science abides by the definite rules which demonstrate the true followings of their leader. Therefore, if you are sincere in your protestations and are doing as you say you will be blessed in your obedience. The words almost froze upon the paper as they were dictated from Mary Baker Eddy's lips, the firm, thin lips that had once asked, lovest thou me? But there was more. The scriptures say, watch and pray that ye enter not into temptation. You are aware that animal magnetism is the opposite of divine science, and that this opponent is the means whereby the conflict against the truth is engendered and developed. Beloved, you need to watch and pray that the enemy of good cannot separate you from your leader and best earthly friend. Okay, let's continue. Poor Mrs. Stetson, who gave her life to Christian Science.
Sentence is error, now and forever. And the final judgment to which olden tenets pointed is when the belief of life or death in matter is destroyed. When the strong fetters of personal sense are broken, man will be free to do God's will, and then we will behold the new heaven and new earth, for the former things shall have passed away, and the material given place to the spiritual. Spirit destroys matter. The harmonious and immortal heavens, earth and moon, will be revealed and understood when science shall take the place of personal sense, and air yield the truth. The sharp experience of earth and the tender wisdom that takes away idols help to hasten this hour and to destroy the belief of happiness in personal sense. Why the pleasure-loving world cannot discern the science of life is because carnal man cannot discern spiritual things. When personal sense yields up the ghost and life is found, soul understands it will be the resurrection of man in truth. But spirit can never be apprehended until matter is understood a myth. Life, that is spirit, is not reached until all error is destroyed. The belief that death is the door to spirituality and life is the air that prevents a better understanding and improvement of being, by which alone immortality is won. We gain immortality through the footsteps of science that reveal truth, life, and love to understanding, in which we learn there are no physical laws, no necessary fulfillment of material conditions, no sin, sickness, or death in life that is soul. That death is a step towards life is error that begets mortality, for belief fulfills the condition of a belief, and therefore will continue to die until the falsehood and error of life, or death and matter, is destroyed. Death is but the stepping stone to other mortal conditions of belief. It never procured life, for this is God, and God must become our practical life before man is found immortal. We see in the vegetable kingdom that the seed must rot to propagate anew, and the poor germ is doomed to this game experience also. It must rot again according to material law. The answer to the ancient question, which is first, the egg or the parent that takes care of the egg, is given when you admit the parent is developed from an egg. For that is first which produced the parent, but an egg never propagated man. We have no right to assume that individuals have grown or been formed under circumstances that made matter conditions essential to their maintenance and reproduction, or important to their origin and first introduction, unless we dismiss reason and revelation utterly. That earth has hatched from the egg of night was anciently argued, and this absurdly is lessened to conclude spirit produces matter, or that it is in matter. Pursuing the varied hypothesis of man, we think as a child, but putting away childish things and asking more earnestly after God, we shall be answered from soul and not sense, and spirit instead of matter will guide our conclusions. Heathen philosophy, modern geology, zoology, physiology, anatomy, etc., deal with other or different phenomena from those proceeding from the Supreme Being. The first proceed from belief only, but the latter are reflections of spirit. These are the ideas of God coming to the understanding, but the former are beliefs of matter. The proof requisite to sustain assumption diametrically opposed to personal sense is just what Jesus taught, namely the fruit they bear, otherwise the demonstrations they bring. If you contradict sense with science and abide by the rules of the latter, you will demonstrate harmony and prove your position the right one. Our experience of what is called life germinating from an egg corresponds with that of Job, that it is a few days and full of trouble. From this material source flow all sorrow, sin, and death, and the power is not in its origin to deliver us from the body of this death. Consequently, our next appeal is to something higher to the matter, drugs, ologies, or isms. We may call on God to heal our sickness, or though we pray 7 times a day, and our clergyman and physician pray for us, we may not gain the blessing. Do faith, but understanding brings the blessing. To know that God is not the author of sin or suffering, and that his band is ride shortened or car heavy, but that the arrow produces error, is to learn what error is, and how destroyed, then shall we find our remedy for sickness and sin, is to work out our own salvation. On this point, mankind need much enlightenment, for the science of being alone solves the problem of man harmoniously. God giveth not a stone for bread when we ask earnestly and strive for health to be useful, able to do good to ourselves and others. Why does he withhold it? These are unanswerable questions, irreconcilable with wisdom, until we learn God is not person but principle, and that we must understand this principle to direct our being in harmony with it, and then shall we be able to govern the physical and mental. All depends on mind. Matter holds no power over man to create or to destroy him. Sickness and death are errors of belief arising from an ignorance of our origin and immortal being. And to be harmonious and immortal, we must understand the science of life that changes our reckoning of life from body to soul and from matter to spirit. Knowing we are intelligence and not intelligent matter, soul and not sense, is the truth that destroys all sickness, sin, and death. Once perceiving the mental hallucination that embitters existence, we shall unmake what mind is made. God sends not one of our diseases, and matter cannot create sensation, nor can it govern mind. Air alone produces air, and all sickness and every discord of earth is air. Thought, let loose somewhat from the old basic theories, amalgamates with other forms of belief and changes them. This we see prototyped in the floral kingdom, in blended tints of leaf and flower. The metaphysical, however, will end as the physical when, according to Agassiz, the intermixing of different species, urged in its final limits, results in the distinct original species. Air must be destroyed at its fountainhead, or it will resume its own proportions and relations. Mind must settle down on an improved basis, even the truth of being, or health will never be universally established. And when this is done, harmonious and immortal man will be the only man. Professor Agassiz has given the origin of mortal and material man. He has traced what we term animal existence through various stages of its embryology, and with most important observations that ought to awaken thought to a higher and purer contemplation of man's origins that must precede the understanding of being. Man is not the offspring of sense, but soul, and coexistent with God. The fact that modern researchers prove animal existence in some instances free from its lowest instinct is worthy of our philanthropy and points to the future footsteps of the science of being. The great point is to understand the principle of being, the life that is eternal, without beginning, without end. And this study will absorb the attention of sage and philosopher at a not far distant day. But the Christian alone will fathom it, for he is that understands better that life is God. We cannot reach his principle unless it be understood. Man's immortality even hangs on understanding the science of being. Because God is the only life and principle of man, that which is good is all that is immortal. But to prove our ignorance of this, we have only to point to the tenacity with which we cling to belief of sickness, sin, and death. Had we the understanding of our God being or the omnipotence of truth, we should have no fear of matter, and having none, our bodies would become harmonious and immortal. A belief of substance matter would then give place to the understanding of substance spirit, for the spiritual body is the only real one, intangible as a material. Ontology receives but little attention from the working day world, and the significance of psychology is shockingly perverted. The science of soul is not mesmerism by any means, and is less understood than all other questions. Little justice is done metaphysics by a utilitarian people where the race is to be the swift. The domestic economy of the bee and its method of multiplying foreshadows the understanding of being yet to come, that mind produces mind, and our belief of matter reproduce beliefs only, is the conclusion that accords with natural history and the science of being. Again we state all is mind, there is no matter, and this needs only to be understood to establish harmony perpetual. Mind is the only actor and produces mind, vis-a-vis the truth or error of man. Matter is not an entity or reality. From the deep sleep that fell upon Adam, Eve was produced. In sleep, cause and effect are beliefs only, that which seems and not that which really is. This was the advent of mortal and material man. Sickness, sin, and death had no real basis, for they originated not with God, spirit, but were beliefs of matter, hence the very opposite of understanding, and without principle or immortality. Therefore they proceeded not from the creative wisdom. All that originated in Adam, that supposed addenda to creation, was not good. It was illusion, the offspring of a dream. Hence it was a belief only, and not the reality of being. Sin, sickness, and death were embraced in this belief of life and matter, and are the dream, and not the reality of life. We classify belief error insomuch as it embraces all that is mortal discord. It changed the standpoint of being from spirit to matter, from understanding to belief, yea, from God to man. Adam was the impersonation of error, but man was the type and image of truth. Adam constituted matter and mortality. Man represented immortality and spirit. But the dream or belief of life in matter is that Adam is man, and that air is truth. There was no more foundation for calling sin, sickness, and death man than for saying, I will make man as God. Should universal mind or belief adapt the appearing of a star as its formula of creation, the advent of mortal man would commence with a star. The belief regarding the origin of mortal man has changed since Adam produced Eve, and the only reason a rib is not the present mode of evolution is because of this change, and more mortal opinions to contend against now than when air first said, believe in me. Conditions of matter are conditions of mind instead. Therefore, the supposed condition becomes imperative as mind only. Air, named Adam, is the belief, or alpha and omega of what is termed life and matter. When mortal belief says an egg produces man, this condition becomes as fixed and imperative as the original one of a rib. That we must breathe in order to live is another belief, whereas the reality of being is life, and its phenomena not dependent on matter. Do you say man was formed before knowing his origin? Then wherefore any belief on this subject? But Eve embodied the maternal egg and was the offspring of Adam's dream, the germ of belief. And mortals, since appearing, are these beliefs. There is no mortal man. The sleep of Adam was what today we term mesmerism, in which belief creates and controls all it creates. In mesmerism, matter is made not to appear solid, and the harmless stick becomes a serpent, according to what mind says of matter. It appears, hence we learn all material things are formed by mind first and last. Belief may adapt any condition whatever, and that will become its imperative mode of cause and effect. The infinite and all-wise Maker condemned this creation, but let it have its experience before the sentence of our God was executed upon it. A mortal body is but a belief of life and matter, and controlled by this belief, its original requirements were less than its educated ones. Consciousness rises above the horizon of personal sense, starting first on conscious thought, and reaching what we falsely term conscious matter before it demands proceed from the body. 'Tis safe to conclude man exists, though he has lost his lungs or any other portion of organism, if he has reached the science of being. His existence is understood and eternal, and man is immortal, only whose life is soul and not sense, God and not matter. We must have the sense and consciousness of being that is independent of matter, self-existent, self-sustaining, and eternal. For this is the science of life that casts out air and heals the sick. We know these statements are on what is called personal sense, but we disregard that altogether. Our only sorrow is not to be understood or to be thought irreverent of God until Christendom learns how important what we say is to follow the rich example of our Master in healing the sick, preaching the gospel to the poor, etc. Today, our religions preach to the rich and depend on matter instead of God to heal the sick. The persecutions truth met over 18 centuries ago, and the demonstration it gave in destroying sickness, sin, and death, and bringing to light immortality. It would be well to remember at this date. And if our readers understood what is written in this book, they will be able to prove to themselves. It reproduces, however faintly, the same proofs. Shall it not then be accepted on the ground our Master said, for the work's sake? Every new idea of truth that comes out from the infinite spirit and touches the ragged shores of belief has been met with derision and chains, scourged out of synagogues at first, but afterwards pardoned and received. To the pulpit we appeal. Judge not this science until you prove whether it be truth or error. Test its principle by the rules laid down, and then you will learn God is the life of man, and that materia medica or theology never can take the place of the science of God in healing the sick and casting out all error. The beliefs that form the body mortal are not destroyed at once. It is not all of death to die. And what is named death, the belief of sickness, sin, and death continues until the science of being is reached, and man's life is found soul and not sense. Adam being created before Eve proves the maternal egg never propagated him, and Eve being formed of Adam's rib shows her origin was not that. Knowledge defined man falsely then, even as a present. Although physiology has since been grafted into the forbidden tree, an infant a few hours old was said to be immersed in water to test the possibility of making him amphibious. And this daily ablution continued until the infant could remain under water and the ordinary function of lungs be suspended 20 minutes at one time, playing the while and enjoying the bath. The infant is wholly controlled by its parents' belief. Addressing the mother mentally, we have stopped the moaning and restlessness of her babe, but could not affect the child except through its mother. This should furnish a hint to parents to control their offspring mentally, beginning in the science of being to govern their bodies, employing mind instead of matter to heal them and alter to prevent their being sick. We should be able at the bedside of a mother, without medicine or application of any sort, to prevent the pangs of childbirth. Labor should be painless, and this dreaded hour be without suffering and joyful, even as the opening of the buds or the development of the flower. Mind controls embryology without pain to the universe, and why not the same with woman? The parent's mind develops the infant before and after birth until the mother says, "My child can take care of itself." At this period, the human species, bird and beast, dismiss their offspring from their immediate maternal eye and commence educating them to what is termed self-dependence. But alas, on the ground that life depends on matter, and this destroys the self-reliance that science would give. Although the advancing stage of human development require the higher order of parental mind to guide their offspring aright, we regret to say the human species make shocking work of it. The peculiar traits and characteristics of progenitors are transmitted from generation to generation, but this is a transfer of belief only, the parent's mind passing to their offspring. The poisonous reptile, bird of prey, beast carnivorous, and mortal man are products of mortal belief, of error, not truth, of sense instead of soul. The belief that life and intelligence belong to the body is the source of all wrong thinking and wrong acting. It takes away from soul and gives to sense, and is the foundation of sickness, sin, and death. All formations are shadows of being, and we their soul and substance, but this fact of science detracts nothing from God, the universal intelligence, and because this statement, understood, brings forth good fruits, heals the sick, and destroys error, we have the Master's rule for its correctness, inasmuch as the tree is known by its fruit. Life is the forming and governing principle of all things, and by no means the frailty that the foot of man crushes out. Soul is the immortal basis of man and the universe, the truth of all things, and the principle that holds the very winds in its fist. Substance is intelligence, yea, spirit, not matter. I am the resurrection and life are the words of him who spake as never man spoke, and knew all about it. But this understanding of truth is today a voice crying in the wilderness of error. All is discord in mortal man. The good he would do is held back by sickness, sin, or death. If he works to benefit his race, he sinks into a premature grave with softened brain or something of the sort. Mental labor should strengthen man. Man is capable of endless action and immortal harmony, but incessant action will destroy matter. Searching into the science of being will never soften a man's brain or produce disease of any kind, but is known to cure disease. And the only difficulty in proving this is the utter ignorance of its principle. But taking an old belief by its throat is surely no small task. Someone like the phoenix, it rises from its own ashes. The influence one mind exerts involuntarily over another is little understood. All our thoughts are molded more or less by others. The body is governed by mind, notwithstanding our utter ignorance of this and involuntary submission to it. If today the general thought embraced the science of being, man's longevity would increase tenfold and immortality be brought to light. The years of man will be extended as the belief of intelligent matter is destroyed, until at length that full recognition of truth shall destroy all sin, sickness, and death. Error will continue 7,000 years from the time of Adam, its origin. At the expiration of this period, truth will be generally comprehended, and science roll back the darkness that now hides the eternal sunshine and lift the curtain on paradise, where earth produces at the command of intelligence and soul instead of sense govern man. End of chapter. Chapter 5. Prayer and Atonement. Thoughts unuttered are not unknown to the infinite intelligence comprehending them, to whom a desire is prayer, and no loss can occur from trusting God with our desires to mold and make higher before they are evolved into action. But prayer has its motives, and what are they? To make him better that prays, or to benefit his hearers, to inform the infinite of what is ignorant, or to be.
Okay, that's it. Talk to you guys later. Bye.